Check one. Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. On behalf of the store, it's such a pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to a special book launch presented by the University of Manitoba Press. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather here tonight is Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all back here physically into the store, and to all of you watching on YouTube now or in the future, to welcome you virtually. We'll go over a few housekeeping notes about the event itself in just a moment, but first, I just wanted to let you know a little bit more about the book we're here to celebrate. Undressed Toronto, From the Swimming Hole to Sunnyside, How a City Learned to Love the Beach, 1850 to 1935, by Dale Barbour, is published by the University of Manitoba Press. It looks at the life of the swimming hole and considers how Toronto turned boys skinny dipping into comforting anti-modernist folk figures. Just to go over a few housekeeping notes before we actually begin. While you are in this space, we ask that you please keep your masks on. When the presenters come up to the front, they will remove their masks to speak. When we move to the signing at the end of the event, we will ask you to remain masked when you leave this space also. But at that point, we'll be moving from a performance space into a retail space. So the law stipulates at that point that we will all have to socially distance as soon as we pass the gray barricades. Thank you very much for that particular indulgence. Following a presentation by the author Dale Barbour, there will be a conversation with Robert Penner. And following that, you'll all have the opportunity to ask questions as well. Rather than have us all pass around a microphone, which seems like an ill-fated idea these days, instead, I'll ask you to just put up your hand and tell me what your question is, and I'll then repeat it into the microphone for the benefit of all those present, as well as all those watching on YouTube. Speaking of the latter, if you are watching on YouTube and have any questions yourself, please feel free to write them into the chat, and we'll be sure to put them to Dale as well. But now I'd like to get on to much more interesting participants tonight, and that would be your host, Robert Penner, who is a historian with a PhD from Duke University in 2012, and a fiction writer. He's the author of Strange Labor, which was published by Radiant Press, and is likely the only book in existence to have full quotes on its back from Rudy Rucker, Kim Stanley Robinson, and David Bergen. He has recently returned to Winnipeg after a long sojourn in the United States. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Robert Penner.
You'll have to forgive me. I'm going to use notes. It's been a long time since I've done such a thing. I'm here to help you celebrate, to participate in the celebration of the launch of Undressed Toronto, and I'm here for two reasons, a combination of two reasons. The first is that, like Dale, I'm a historian, but there's plenty of them. And the second is that I've known him for a very, very long time. There's plenty of people who've done that too, but I'm in the middle of that Venn diagram of historians and people that have known Dale for a very, very, very long time. So here I am. As a historian, I can say that Undressed Toronto was a wonderful book, one that methodically and rigorously explores not simply how Torontonians enjoyed bathing in the city's rivers and along its waterfronts, but how such cultural practices changed over time and the reasons for those changes, and the shifting legal, social, and economic context in which those changes occurred. But it seems to me that you can find that out yourself by reading this book, as you should, and that it is as a friend of Dale's rather than a colleague that I can contribute something more plausibly interesting to our discussion than my professional opinion. To me, Undressed Toronto is a deeply personal book. It was very much Dale's voice I heard when I read it, Dale's personality I was reminded of by the text. And it stirred up a wealth of memories for me, of which I'm going to share three. All three of them are from quite some time ago, and I hope all three will illuminate, if we have to squint a little at them, for them to do so, how very much Undressed Toronto is not simply a meticulously researched and argued historical text, but also very much a product of Dale's life and career, or careers. And in this book, we can see at play evidences of what we might call, should we choose to, a particular interpretive attitude towards the world that, in my experience, has always been a part of Dale, or at least has been a part of him since we first met as journalism students at Red River Community College sometime in the early 1990s. Anecdote 1, I'm calling structure and narrative. The early 1990s were for most of us still the beginning of the computer age. Dale used to call us the Pong generation because we were the first children to be entirely dumbfounded by a moving pixel in a video game. Red River provided us a computer lab filled with cubicle Macs, and because so few of us had laptops or computers at home, we spent a lot of time there trying to write journalistic, PR, and advertising narratives about the city of Winnipeg and the province that were spare and focused enough to satisfy our instructors. Dale produced such narratives with the rest of us, but was generally just barely on time with his assignments, not because of competition for computers, although there was such, and not because he was perfectionist, although he may have been, but because those computers could be used not only for word processing, but for playing a game called Sim City, in which a player attempted to plan, develop, and grow a city from a few houses on a couple of streets to a humming metropolis crippled by traffic jams, overpopulation, and post-industrial decay. We can already see Toronto in his future. Dale was certainly interested in straightforward descriptive narratives of the sort that our instructors demanded, but he was also, alas, obsessed with the structure and functionality of urban space, to such a degree that I'm certain there were mornings I saw him in the computer lab when I got there, not because he was an early riser, as far as I know he's not, but because he was a committed analyst of the city as a structure, one whose commitment to that structure stood in a tense relationship with the immediate requirements of narrative, a contradiction I'm pleased to say he has at least temporarily resolved in this book. Anecdote 2, liminality and nostalgia. As I read in Undressed Toronto about river's edges and youthful mishaps and young men fleeing from the police, I was reminded of more incidents from Dale's past. Not that there were any runnings away from the police that I personally am aware of, but he was always, it seemed to me, attracted to liminal and feral places, to explorations along the river's edge, and minor boundary pushing of the sort that occurs throughout this book, and which, rather importantly, at least in this book, is frequently forgiven by the city elders on the basis of a shared nostalgia. Dale and I found ourselves spending one Canada Day without any access to fireworks. It being late in the evening and pleasant out, we went to the 7-Eleven that was on Osborne near the Oakwood Cafe, bought some harmless looking fireworks of our own, took them down to the river's edge and launched them. They hit the branches of an overhanging tree and came straight back at us like howitzer shells. We fled like children. I mention this anecdote not just as an example of how the boundaries between the urban and the natural continue to be spaces where the young explore boundaries between the legal and not legal, but because such youthful indiscretions continue to be winked at, providing they meet certain race, gendered, and class parameters. They're winked at by middle-aged white men like myself. And this essentially conservative relationship between youthful rebellion and settler nostalgia is one of the more provocative themes of this book. Finally, anecdote 3, absurdity and sympathy. Dale had these two cats, two young male cats, and he either postponed getting them fixed or he thought maybe he wouldn't. And I can't remember the details. I'm going to get a few of the facts wrong, but that's okay, you'll get the gist. He had these two young male cats, and one day he walked into the apartment and discovered they weren't kittens anymore, but snarling, aggressive, spitting toms. One of these toms attacked him, and when he was firm with it, the other attacked him as well, out of solidarity, I imagine. I've always imagined the scene as something from Jurassic Park, the velociraptors maybe, and Dale as the T-Rex. Dale, ever resourceful, seized a couple of throw pillows, curled and guided the little monsters into his bedroom and locked them in. Then, and again, this is how I remember it, this might not be the exact historical sequence, He joined me and a few friends at the Pembina for a pint, and he told us the story and returned home to find me snuggled up on his bed, purring and delighted to see him. What, you may ask, does this have to do with Undressed Toronto and interpretive attitudes? Simply this. The absurdity of the situation brought Dale tremendous joy. I suspect it still does. And in this book, it is frequently the absurdity of the human situation that catches his eye. It's one of my favorite things about the book, the absurdities. They invite his questions, the foibles and the contradictions and the unexpected ironies that attract him to problems that he wants to solve. And yet he's never condescending in this book, or outraged or angry at his subjects, no matter how absurd they get. He treats them as gently as he did his two cats, recognizing that they too are caught up by forces beyond them, in circumstances too complex for them to understand. That sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the most useful interpretive attitude to the past is the one that helps you see the complexities and the contradictions most clearly, is a careful, ironic sympathy. And that is the tone of the book. It is this attitude, combined with his long-standing preoccupations with how to wed political narrative to structural analysis, and a sensitivity towards and interest in those places, spaces, and practices in a city which are either not yet defined or have escaped their original definition, or which simply cannot be captured by the language of bureaucrats and police and city councilors, that make this study of public urban bathing such a marvelous book, and a book that is very much his. At this stage, I'm going to introduce Dale and let him answer in more detail and with more brio the questions you might have of his marvelous book. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to give a few thank yous, then I'm going to say a few things, then I'm going to read a bit of a stretch from the book, and we're going to look at some pictures. So first, the thank yous, and I'm going to keep this short. This came from a dissertation originally, so I want to throw to thanks to my advisors at the University of Toronto. So Steve Penfold, Mariana Valverde, Ian Radford, and the crew that managed my defense. Thank you to you. Thank you to the University of Manitoba Press. Thank you to John for adjusting the microphone. University of Manitoba Press, I'm not going to name you all, but suffice it to say there's a lot of hands that touch a book on its way from copy to the bookshelf. I will name David Carvin. Thank you, David, for your help in this. And I want to thank the history departments at Brandon University, the University of Manitoba, and the University of Winnipeg, and St. John's College, which all in one way or another helped me get here. The Toronto hockey crew, I'm going to thank them. And of course, my family, always my family. Thank you. Now, I'm going to say a few things about the book, and specifically the title. Undressed Toronto, what's up with that? It actually has two meanings. The first, I think, is kind of obvious. I'm talking about people who used to both bathe in the nude and had to learn to wear a bathing suit. Swimming was going to become a public activity that men and women could do together. You had to convince people, primarily men who were used to swimming in the nude, to suit up. And eventually they did, grudgingly. Just a picture of Toronto to get us going, or a map of Toronto to get us going here. When you see pictures of people in these cumbersome bathing suits, and you wonder, how did they swim in those get-ups? Let me assure you, a lot of them hated them, and they weren't afraid to say so back in the 19th century. They said so at length. But there was a lot at stake in convincing, these grumpy men that they had to give up the privilege of bathing in the nude. In Toronto, Hanlon's Point in Sunnyside, which is what you're looking at there, become the hub for commercial activity that includes boardwalks, dance halls, amusement parks, baseball diamonds, and so on. Much as those of us in Winnipeg Beach and Grand Beach did here. So again, there's a lot to be gained in creating the public beach. But boy, it took some work. And a lot of what I talk about in this book is the work it took to get to there. So that's the first meaning, getting people dressed. The second meaning I'd like to think is a little more clever. I want us to think about how a city like Toronto gets dressed. And by dressed, I mean it lays down a network of rules, regulations, expectations about how people will use the streets and public spaces. All of this has to be laid down in the city. And we can see that process in this book. We get a steady list of new rules about where you can bathe, when, and what you need to wear. And even expectations about how people will use the waterfront. It's supposed to be a place of industry and commerce, or perhaps where people, will try to catch a ferry. But there were also undressed, what I like to call undressed spaces in the city. These are areas where people are breaking the rules. They're still bathing in the nude. And the funny thing is that these areas are right in the heart of the city. And a lot of times people can see them. So I'm going to give us a couple of readings that look at two of these undressed areas. Now, the first is right on the waterfront. We're talking about an area that's now just a little ways west of the CN Tower. But back in 1887, which is what we'll be looking at, it was just a stone's throw away from the water. Now, Toronto's historians tell us that by the 1880s, this was a polluted area. It was industrial. It was lost for recreation. That's the area we're going to be talking about here. It doesn't look endearing. And its neighboring areas looked kind of like this. So it doesn't look like a healthy prospect for bathing. And, we're told that people weren't there. That's how Toronto liked to imagine its waterfront. So I'll kick off my reading, just taking a look at this area. So to begin, it was hot. Scorching is how a Globe reporter described the weather after he ventured down to the city's waterfront in early August 1887. It had been hot all summer. Daily highs averaged close to 30 Celsius in July, and the heat lingered into August. Caught in a sweltering urban environment that generated its own heat island, Torontonians turned to nature for relief. Men had it easier. They slept in the parks without fear of danger or sanction, or stripped down and dove into Toronto's rivers or Lake Ontario without shame to escape the heat. It was bathers along the waterfront that the Globe reporter was seeking when he went there in August 1887. They were not supposed to be there, not in a state of undress anyway. By 1887, Toronto had revised its bathing bylaw to allow people to bathe during the daylight hours, provided they wore a neck-to-knees bathing dress. Nudity during the day, however, remained officially forbidden. But the reporter knew the human geography of the industrial waterfront. A great rallying place for bathers is the Credit Valley Wharf, he wrote. This structure stretches well out into the water. And as the freight shed, which stands on the shore, is not used, the place from the land is somewhat secluded. It is, however, in most conspicuous view of the ferries as they pass and repass to Hanlon's Point, an amusement park on Toronto Island. And what might people on a ferry boat see? And this is a quote from the Globe. On fine warm days, this wharf from end to end forms a gallery of living statuary of all sizes. The urchins paddle naked in the warm, dirty water under the shore, near the shore, which the scum floating on the surface renders perfectly opaque. While a little further out are to be found those who are better swimmers, who have ambitions towards the end of the dock. This latter point is the stamping grounds for a number of young men, almost full grown, with a certain following of boys who, boy-like, are ever anxious to follow in the footsteps of their leaders, no matter into what danger it may lead them. All of them, of course, are guiltless of attire, and when not diving into the deep water, stand in rows upon the end of the wharf, waiting until they feel like another plunge. So the naked masculinity of Toronto's working class bathers displayed itself for the Globe reporter and the city's elite as they cruised upon the bays. And yet, for all that he flagged the environmental and safety risks of bathing off the waterfront, the reporter did not call for an end to it. Rather, his debate was over what to do with the public presentation of the naked male body. Quote, that for the sake of public decency, the bylaw should be enforced goes without saying. But it may be asked, would it not be well to allow bathers to use such places as the Credit Valley Wharf if clad in trunks, without requiring bathing dresses to be used? One thing is certain, the young men and boy offenders will never wear the more cumbersome dresses. Now, the Globe story earned a rebuttal letter from A. Johnson. Quote, your young man does not seem to have much to do these warm days, so it seems that he is exerting himself to discover some place where the boys may be indulging in a bath in the bay. His keen eye has spied the boys enjoying themselves without bathing dresses, screened by the Credit Valley Railway storehouse on the Esplanade. And why should not the boys go in swimming naked as they came into the world? A bathing dress takes away the luxury of a bath. The human body in a healthy state is a beautiful object to behold. Now, the Globe described the bathers as being on display for passing tourists and highlighted the mingling of men and boys. But Johnson portrayed them as screened and hidden by the industrial infrastructure. If people saw them, it was because they consciously chose to look. Johnson also infantilized the bathers, turning them all into boys to maintain their innocence. Poor boys, he concluded. Just let them bathe where your young man saw them. No person is obliged to go and look at them. Evil be to him who evil thinks. So again, a bit of defense from both sides. Now, were they boys or were they men? It depended who you asked. When we look at people drowning along the waterfront, it really looks like it was a mix of both. But if you're A. Johnson, better to call them boys and shame the Globe for looking at their youthful hijinks. But if on fine warm days, this wharf from end to end forms a gallery of living statuary of all sizes, why is Toronto forgotten them? Why don't we have pictures of them? On the waterfront, I think industry played a role. And Toronto wanted to see something like this. It wanted to see commerce. It wanted to see industry. It didn't want to imagine boys bathing off its commercial waterfront. Technology also played a role. Even if the Globe reporter had wanted to snap pictures in 1887, he didn't have a camera cheap enough or fast enough to capture men and boys diving off the docks. It would be 10 or 15 years later before we'd have that sort of technology that could put a picture in the newspaper. So in some ways, technology, pictures, is hiding the 19th century waterfront from us. Now, I'll do one more quick reading, this time from the Don River, which is a short river. It's just 38 kilometers long on the east side of Toronto. And there's going to be an awkward silence as I dig out that reading. So the Don River. Albert Petrie, age 19, slipped in behind the Rosedale train station to bathe in the Don River on Saturday, June 14, 1913. An orphan, Petrie lived in a boarding house run by Mrs. Georgia Thom at 63 St. James Avenue, just west of the Don River. And he worked at Hope's Bird Store on Queen Street West. He had joined 13-year-old Gordon Thom and a number of other boys and young men for a swim. On that warm spring day, Petrie stepped into a deep hole in the stream bed and slipped beneath the water. Now we get a quote. Albert was used to the water, and we never expected any trouble until we saw him go down, Gordon Thom said, suggesting how Petrie was expected to know the river and have a feel for where its dangers lurked. Quote, we were frightened and yelled out to the brakeman on a train that was passing, He ran down, only taking off his shoes, and dived 3 or 4 times. At last, he got the body, and he and another brakeman and 2 other men worked over the body for a long time. Now, the image of a rail worker racing to the river, kicking off his shoes, and diving into rescue a drowning teenager is probably the best example one might find of the melding of industry and recreation in Toronto. The Don River was a borderland space, the ragged edge between nature and development. The clanging of trains mingled with the sound of rushing water, and the screech of brakes signaled trouble along the river. Now, if the bathers were forgotten on the central waterfront, and they were, when historians talk about Toronto's central waterfront, they describe it as a polluted space. If they were forgotten in the central waterfront, they've always been remembered in the Don River. And here, particularly as we get into the 20th century, the camera went in often to capture these bathers in the Don River. And I argue it's doing something with them. Toronto is doing something with them. It's turning them into these kind of, nostalgic figures. And you can see the Don River. William James, famous photographer in Toronto, took this picture. People going to swimming lessons in the Don River in the 1910s and 1920s. Now, the great thing is, if you look through James' collections, you can find multiple versions of this picture. He kept going back to capture the same picture. Why? Because he recognized a money shot when he saw it. He knew that this picture was going to sell, it's going to capture a certain ethos of the Don River. Then we get other ones like this. And this is probably a little closer to what the Don actually looked like. If you look close in this picture, you can see clumps of bathers. There's even the off chance that the police are rousting out bathers on the one side of the river, and the others on the far side are kind of seeing that happening and bolting out of the way. But I've never been able to concern that. I've never been able to be sure that's actually what's happening. But I speculate about that. And I think I'll conclude my reading there.
Thanks, Dale.
You're welcome, Rob.
That was great. Before I open it up to the audience for questions, I've got a couple myself. I'll limit myself to 2. The first is that although this book is filled with characters, if it were a novel, the main characters are all these spaces and places in the environment. And by far, the most interesting of these characters is the Don River, to the extent that in your introduction, loving the Don River. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little about what it is about a river, specifically the Don, that was so attractive to you as an historical subject.
What I love about the Don is that you get different versions of the Don if you look through history books. There's a polluted version. Toronto turned away from the Don River and imagined it as this polluted space. And yet at the same time, you can see how it was played up, even in contemporary times, as this recreational space, this natural space, this space beyond the urban environment. So I love the historiography of the Don. From a personal point of view, if you're in Toronto, the Don, as historians, we always like to talk about ideas of nature. Ideas of nature formed in the 19th century as a contrast to the urban environment, So that when you went to someplace like the Dawn or Toronto Island or Winnipeg Beach, you were getting away from it all. And we can see these ideas kind of coming into creation in the 19th century. So as historians, we study that. As people, we're still creatures of those attitudes. So, I mean, the Dawn is, for me, it's a refuge. It was a place I could get out on my bike, bomb up, it's 38 kilometers long. You can bike the length of this river. And in the book, I talk about the sort of embodied relationship that the swimmers had with the river. They had to, know where the danger spots were, know where police might come from, different risks like that. As a cyclist, you still have an embodied relationship with the river. I can close my eyes and still imagine biking along the Dawn and feeling every crest and curve and every expected hill. So that was the Dawn for me, as a person living in Toronto, it was a refuge.
Related to this idea of embodiment and sort of conceptualizing the space, you talk about different types of bathers in the book, and in particular, the type that would use the Dawn and what you call experience this embodiment there. And you came up with the concept of the vernacular bather. And I'm just wondering if you could develop that just a little for the audience, explain what it is and why you chose that word in particular to describe it.
Yeah, the vernacular bather. It does come back to this idea of an embodied relationship with the environment. I think if you're swimming in someplace like the Dawn, you have to learn your environment. You have to learn your swimming hole. Where are the danger points? How deep is the water? Am I at risk of danger? Am I at risk of drowning here? And you can see these people learning their environment and exchanging that knowledge back and forth. Doesn't always work. It was still a dangerous environment. People drowned. But they had to rely on each other for help. They had to rely on each other for instructions about the environment. Now, I think a public bathing beach is a little bit different. It, in some ways, the beach was made to dull the senses. The ideal beach is smooth sand, stretching out so you can walk in gently. You don't have to worry about any holes. There's a lifeguard over there that's supposed to protect you. There's a zone where you know how that beach is going to behave. So in some ways, the beach puts us into a protected, a shaped space, space where there's guards around us. And then vernacular bathers didn't have that.
Yeah, I know I said I was going to only ask two, but there's a third one.
Damn it.
I should. We haven't talked much about governance, and you talked about these two types of spaces where the vernacular bathers were, and then the public beaches, and you talked about that, people drowning. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little about governance, how governance played into these historical shifts, and maybe you could also venture a suggestion about what sort of lessons this book has for contemporary governance in similar type situations.
I mean, in some ways, this is a book about governance, which is the least sexy way to sell a book with bathers on the cover. But it is kind of like that. We're seeing a whole system of different ways of governing people coming into place. Where can you bathe? How do you dress when you bathe? We have a lifeguard system around to surveil you as you bathe. So, I mean, in some ways, the beach is all about governance. And I guess one of the things I'm trying to do here is, show how the governance gets laid over a city and how it is a cultural thing as well. Because one of the things I'm arguing is the beach is kind of a cultural intervention in Toronto. They always had sand, they always had water, but the sort of rules and expectations of the beach, they actually had to bring into the city. You can see them consciously bringing it in and deciding how it's going to work locally. So in that sense, governance is brought in, but there is dickering, there is negotiation over how it's going to work locally, over how it's going to land when it arrives. I think I rambled. That's probably the best I'm going to do on that one.
All right, thanks. I'll open it up now, John, to the audience.
Perfect. So if anyone here does have any questions, please put up your hand and I'll wander over to see you. And if any of you folks watching on YouTube have a question, feel free to just write it into the chat and we'll be sure to interrogate Dale with it immediately. Getting into bathing suits was a challenge, wasn't it? Because they normally didn't own them, they had to rent them.
Yeah, a lot of them, you couldn't afford a bathing suit. A bathing suit was like an expensive item to buy. So for the working class, certainly, yeah, you rented them and you used them for a special event. And makes you think about how going to the beach was a special event. It's like, okay, I'm going to rent my bathing suit. I'm going to go to the beach. For boys, and even for men, they probably still rented their bathing suits when they went to the beach. But if they were going somewhere less official, maybe they did without, or maybe they had a pair of trunks, just basic bathing trunks that they would use for that sort of purpose. So yeah, when I think about that question, it makes me think about how they probably negotiated, these sort of different options depending on where they were, how much money they had at the time, and what they wanted to do. Anything else on that?
Oh yes, I'll repeat this. So, renting the trunks would be a way of keeping poor people out of the water, wouldn't it? Because they couldn't necessarily afford to rent the bathing suit, and they weren't allowed to swim in the nude.
Some of the early places where they started doing this, they actually put a price limit on how much they could charge for renting the bathing suits. The initial places on Toronto Island, for example, they said, okay, and I'm not going to remember the exact amount, but you can only charge X amounts for people who want to bathe here. I'm less quick to say that it kept them out of the water, though, because I think in all of these places, they were still going elsewhere. And in Toronto, you see definitely into the through the 90s, the 1890s, there were actually areas set aside as designated, you don't have to wear a bathing suit here areas, as a way to say, okay, not everyone has a bathing suit, and some people still want to bathe and bathe without. So on the main shoreline, they set up a couple of those, and on Toronto Island, they set up a couple of those. And I think it was kind of a negotiation of the price as well.
Were there any spaces where women could bathe?
Yes. I think unofficially, women were probably finding their own spaces. We start to see it kind of in the newspapers and the record books. We start to see that in Toronto Island. In the late 1870s, they actually start referring to areas where they know women are going to bathe. Women are going and bathing, and we start to get kind of smaller scale places renting bathing suits and things like that. The first kind of official bathing place that gets flagged in the records in Toronto is on Toronto Island, and it's called the Women's Bathing House, or the Women's Baths, and that's actually spelled WIMAN after Erastus Wiman, who was the guy who put forward money to set up this public bath. It was set up on Toronto Island. They built a bathhouse, and they said, and the deliberate goal was to say, okay, let's have a spot where men and women can bathe together. So we're going to rent bathing suits to men. We're going to rent bathing suits to women that they can go there and bathe. They had to figure out how it was going to work. Do we let them bathe in the water together? Do we separate them with a line between them? All of that was sort of negotiated. And of course, how the bathing suits were supposed to work. So unofficially earlier, but that's when they started to come on land in the established system.
So historian Jim Blanchard suggests that you should write about spas, potentially, or look into them somewhat. He did.
I heard about a bit of that question. I don't think that's quite how it went.
But also brought up that there were quite a number of spas historically around, and including one by the Louise Bridge. And yes.
There is in Toronto as well. I do talk about it a little. Like it's not as much my focus, but I do talk about that a little. Like the first one actually pops up in the 1830s, and it's what's called a floating bath, and they plop it on the waterfront. And it's actually kind of a posh space. It has areas for men and women within it, separated by a wall so that they never see each other. And there's even like a tea room and a reading room as part of this. But it's floating on the water. You go in there, you can like soak in the lake water, get changed, and then kind of relax reading a book. Would it be more for the upper class? And then through the 19th century, we do have different sort of internal baths because, of course, most people didn't have baths at home or the option of running water at home until later on. So yeah, there are sort of these public baths throughout the 19th century. Throughout the 19th century in Toronto, generally privately owned, generally for profit. It's not until the we get into the 1990s and the early 20th century that we start to get public baths. And some of the first pools were imagined that way as public baths. So I mean, yeah, they have a pool and everything, but the idea was that this is also a place where a lot of people are going to go and have a shower and like wash themselves. And even, I'm going to keep going here, Sunnyside, the main beach in Toronto, its bathhouse had kind of a public bath logic to it as well. The big beach house, and I have some pictures of it in the book, set up on the lake, set up with the idea that people are going to bathe in the lake, but it's fenced off, you have to pay to go in there. And when you leave the bathhouse, they even showered you before you stepped into the lake. It was almost as if you were going into a pool. And they debated even chlorinating the water to create a cleaner bathing environment. So, I mean, there is kind of that bathhouse logic. Let's go through this.
We have a question from Barb on YouTube who is wondering, do you know of other Canadian cities and how nude bathing transformed in them? Was Toronto a special case in how bathing transformed it?
I'm not sure Toronto was that special. I think something like the Don River was kind of special, this sort of nostalgic, very well-known public space. But this idea of these, hidden spaces around the city where people could bathe, I think a lot of the different cities had them. Even Winnipeg, if you talk to people about bathing in the Red River, a lot of them, I think, remember doing it in their youth. They had their different skinny dipping spaces when they were Assiniboine. So in that sense, I'm not sure Winnipeg, or I'm not sure Toronto is that distinct. And even the evolution of nude beaches as kind of public spaces. Hanlon's Point and Wreck Beach actually follow a pretty similar arc. They kind of re-emerge in some ways as gay nude beaches starting in the 1950s, become more popular by the 1970s, and then kind of go mainstream from there.
Thank you very much. We have another
Oh my God, he's still here.
I have another question from YouTube. That is, did the Manitoba, Winnipeg, Grand Victoria beach experience at the time have many similarities, or were the Torontonians trendsetters?
I think what I'll say about Winnipeg Beach, Grand Beach, that sort of thing, is set up by the CPR, set up by the CNR, and they knew what they were doing when they set up Winnipeg Beach. They said, okay, we're going to create a beach resort here, and laid out the formula for doing it. And we could see Toronto doing that with Sunnyside in the 20th century. But these earlier beaches in the 19th century, Toronto had to kind of figure those out, how they're going to work when it lands in Toronto's environment. Places on the East Coast of the United States, East Coast of Canada, had public beaches by the 1850s, earlier on. But in some ways, they kind of have to move into the continent and sort of get renegotiated as they land in different cities. But by 1900, when Winnipeg Beach is being set up, we know what a beach should be. We know how it should work, and here's how we're going to do that in terms of profit.
Thank you. Were there any further questions? All right. Well, if there are no further questions, if you, Robert, or Dale have any closing comments you might like to make?
I'll just quickly say that I think what the questions have shown us is how like deep and thick the content of this book is. That there's really a lot going on in there, and it's not just about nudity or not nudity or spas or not spas, but there's a whole sort of complex history about the relationship of politics and technology and culture happening in this text that's useful for thinking about other things as well. So it's not just about the vernacular or swimming or any of that. It's a lot more. It's about thinking very carefully and meticulously about governance and culture and technology in the colonial Canadian city.
And I guess I'll just wrap up by saying there's a lot of swimming in this book. So if you're into swimming, pick up this book. It is for you. Beyond that, thank you everyone for coming on this rainy night. Thanks to my family from local and from the West Coast who have managed to journey in for the event. Nice to see everyone here. And have a good night, everyone.
Perfect. So we'll now move along to the signing portion of the evening. So we'll ask you all just to remain seated for one moment while we move Dale to a table that's immediately beside our cash desk. Again, once we leave the space, if we could just ask you to ensure that you socially distance while you get into line, that would be wonderful. Books are available for purchase at our central cash desk, so if you'd like to buy those before getting in line, you're very welcome to. You will hear some ominous announcements indicating that the store is closing at 8 o'clock. Please rest assured this does not apply to you folks. You do have special privilege to be here until the signing is actually over. You will not be kicked out. Otherwise, please do feel free to, again, purchase the book before you get in line or immediately thereafter. Just do please remember to pay for the book before you physically leave the store tonight. Thank you all so very much for joining us here tonight, both physically and virtually. And thanks again to the University of Manitoba Press, to Robert Penner, and of course, to Dale Barbour. Have a lovely evening.